Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickel. I'm on staff here at Whitfinstock and I am the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So on this episode, I talk with Dr. John H. Buchanan about his 2022 Cascade book entitled Processing Reality, Finding Meaning in Death, Psychedelics, and Sobriety. John received his doctorate in liberal arts from Emory University and was trained and certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner by Stan and Christina Grof. He's also the contributing co-editor for a volume entitled Rethinking Consciousness, Extraordinary Challenges for Contemporary Science, which came out in 2020. So with that, let's jump over to the interview. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. All right, I'm privileged to be here today with Dr. John H. Buchanan, who is the author of the book Processing Reality, Finding Meaning in Death, Psychedelics, and Sobriety, which is one of just a few so far in our Perspectives in Process Studies series. So, John, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. As we begin, could you maybe share with our listeners a bit about yourself and about your work?
Sure. Very happy to be here with you. As I was just telling you, I live in Wisconsin, where I grew up. I traveled around to a bunch of colleges and universities, and I was always lucky enough to find an unconventional program at these places. I started at New College down in Florida, and by the time I got there, I was already pursuing these questions that had come up from some psychedelic experiences I've had and some other major turning points in my life. Then I went up to University of Wisconsin Green Bay, which is a new university, and had some unconventional disciplinary setup. Then I went to West Georgia College for a master's in humanistic psychology. There's only I think there's only one other college, Sonoma State, that was offering that degree. And then I ended up at Emory University, which had the Institute of the Liberal Arts, which was an interdisciplinary doctoral program, which is perfect for me because throughout this whole time, I was looking into philosophy and psychology primarily, but also religion and mythology and just about anything I could get hold of that might shine some light on psychedelic experience in particular, and the nature of reality and our lives in general. In my book, I mentioned 5 pivotal experiences. The first was my father's sudden death when I was 11 years old, which really changed the trajectory of my life and feelings about the world. So that was really probably my first unconscious instigator of looking into these basic questions about the meaning in life. And my psychedelic experiences, which really started when I was about 19, were also very important in that regard. And I was lucky enough to study with Jean Houston through my 20s, doing workshops and seminars with her. And she was a terrific resource for all kinds of, besides psychedelics. She and her husband had written one of the first books in the 60s. So interdisciplinary book on psychedelics that was terrific. And so she's also, though, interested in these same areas of mythology and psychology, and so she was fantastic. And I was also lucky enough to study with Stan Grof, who was, I'd say, the preeminent researcher in psychedelics. So I was very lucky in these regards, and also I was lucky to run into some great teachers along the way. By the time I got to Emory, I still hadn't figured out a just general take on what was going on. I looked at a lot of stuff. But there, after my first term, my advisor said, Will Beardsley's leaving. You might want to take a look at Alfred North Whitehead's philosophy before he goes and retires. And I hadn't considered this at all, and I did, and thought, wow, this is really what kind of thing I was looking for.
Mm.
And I was lucky enough to do some off-campus study down in Claremont, California, with David Griffin, who was a brilliant Whiteheadian, and I was out there because of my last pivotal experience, which was getting sober after about 12 years of drinking and psychedelics. At first being fascinating, then being problematic, and then being necessary towards the very end. So fortunately, it was a real turning point, though. Going through Betty Ford Center, I realized I was near Claremont. I could, studied with Whiteheadians there, and then realized that Stan Grof was living and teaching up at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and I ended up going up there, and so that was a big turning point in my life. But enough about me.
No. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing all that. Yeah. No, given your interdisciplinary interests, I'm excited to hear your response to the next question, which is something we ask everybody who comes on the show. So our opener question: if you could place any three thinkers, dead or alive, together in a room, and you can listen into their conversation, which three thinkers would you choose and why?
Yeah, there's some deceased family members I'd like to meet, but we'll rule those out. And if I was actually going to be meeting them and not just listening in, I'd love to meet Alfred North Whitehead. I'd love to meet William James.
Sure.
And I'd also throw in John von Neumann. I'm fascinated by this kinds of sheer geniuses, kinds of people that can remember everything they've ever read, or whatever, wherever they turn their mind to a problem, they're already the top person on it. So I think it'd just be interesting to meet him. But more pertain to your question, the three, it's a little tricky, but the three I came up with are Olaf Stapledon, C.S. Lewis, and Colin Wilson. And they all, Olaf Stapledon, many of your listeners may not recognize the name, but he was a huge early influence in science fiction and speculative fiction, and was actually a Whiteheadian and very interested in mystical experience, and wrote his magnum opus is Star Maker. And I find he was basically trying to take his thinking in philosophy and psychology and present it as science fiction to kind of get people to read it. And C.S. Lewis, everything he writes, I love. He's just so brilliant. But I particularly liked when I was 18, I read his space trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. And he was actually writing part of it in refutation of Olaf Stapledon, because he felt like,
interesting.
He felt like he thought we don't need to take our neuroses and sickness, spiritual sickness, to other planets. We should solve it here, deal with it here first, and not lay that on other people. But he admired thought Stapledon was a brilliant writer, and Colin Wilson I actually got to know. I don't. Do you know Colin?
I don't know Colin.
He wrote about 100 books. He was in his early 20s. He wrote this book that made him super famous in England. Its name's evading me, but he was one of the angry young men. There's a play out. Look Back in Anger was one of that author was one of them. And Colin Wilson also said that was funny because he wasn't really angry at all. But he wrote. He was very interested in experience on the borderline, sort of on the edge of society. And so he wrote about criminality, he wrote about parapsychology, and he wrote novels, he wrote science fiction, and he wrote serious nonfiction. But I invited him to a conference in Atlanta when I was down there, and he and his wife came over, and he's just a very delightful man. So I'd love to see the three of them batting ideas around about psychology and philosophy and fiction and their thoughts on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just looking him up because, like I said, I haven't heard of him. Is the book you were thinking of called The Outsider?
Yes, it is.
Okay, that seems to be the one that's popping up a lot. Is that a novel?
No, he's looking at artists and other people who were like Dostoevsky, people he feels that were on the outside, as I was saying, of society, and because they're on the outside, they have a different kind of perspective than the everyday perspective on what's going on, and he actually thinks that gives him an advantage.
Hmm.
Trying to think who he had some other authors. I haven't read it for about 30 years, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's that's a long
Unlike
ways to
John von
recall.
Neumann, I don't remember everything
Yeah,
I've read.
yeah, no worries. Awesome. Okay, well let's get into your book. So I want to talk about in your opening chapter. You write that you had this sort of sudden and vivid insight, is the language you used, that you had during kind of an early for you LSD trip. And so you describe this as, or you also say in that opening chapter, right? The essence of psychedelic awareness lies at the intersection between psychology, philosophy, and religion. So this is sort of the insight you had during this LSD trip. I wonder if you could say more about what you mean by this. I know it's a broad statement and a broad question, but I'm curious in what ways, kind of in your own experience and your own thinking, do you see psychedelic awareness kind of having to do with these different domains, these domains of psychology, philosophy, and religion?
Yes, that day it was an afternoon, and this is before I went off to college. I'd gotten back from traveling for 3 months with my sister, and I got started taking psychedelics, and I was at this apartment where we did a lot of that kind of thing. And I was walking across the floor, and I suddenly had this image of like a Venn diagram of religion, psychology, and philosophy.
Yeah,
These three
yeah.
overlapping circles, and in the middle was this experiential realm, which was this psychedelic or mystical state, where spontaneous insight and revelation sort of was pouring out that seemed to relate to all three areas. And I thought, well, this is the answer. I just have to keep tapping into this space,
Yeah.
and because when I was in other times when I was in there, it would feel as if I'd start thinking about a philosophical question, and the answers would start. How should I put it? Start building. That probably kind of in a Hegelian way. Well, this
Mm.
implies that, but that implies this, but that implies
Mhm.
that, and
Mhm.
then it would finally get to this place where it was more of a revelatory opening that was not thought could not penetrate beyond. Um, so that space was very exciting. But more to your question, I think that when conventional thinking that when psychedelics break down the usual ego experiential boundaries, it opens up the normally unconscious depths, which spontaneously triggers fundamental insights and questions about the nature of the self and the world and spirituality. So there you have psychology, philosophy, and religion,
Mhm.
and these things seem to just I think by obviously just shaking up dramatically one's normal frame of reference, it it raises these questions, and sometimes the experiences are very powerful and very deep. People have experiences of encountering godlike entities, or huge. We'll have an experience that going back to the Big Bang and re-experiencing the entire history of the universe. So
Mm.
naturally, these kinds of things get you thinking
Mhm. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
about what's real. That's my thoughts on this question.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
something
Yeah.
else though you were wanting me to get at?
No, no, that's great.
Hoping I
Yeah,
would.
no. Yeah, no, I was kind of curious too if I mean, yeah, obviously those three domains pertain in a direct way to psychedelics. I was curious too if it was a bit of a like autobiographical occurrence for you where you had lots of interests in these three kind of domains that you were kind of reading and researching in all of them, and then in the moment of kind of a altered state, right? Mentally altered state through these psychedelics. if it was sort of an experience of the unity of those, that in your ordinary thinking or in your ordinary reading is maybe too difficult or too complex to pull together. I don't know if what I'm saying is making sense, but
Yeah,
does
I
that
see what
does that does that resonate with you?
actually, it was just the opposite. I
Okay.
hadn't really, I hadn't really thought much about. I mean, I thought a little bit, but had just turned 19,
Okay.
and and I mean, Nina High School was fine, but I didn't take any classes in philosophy or psychology or
Sure.
religion,
Sure.
and my mother gave me was a was a very interesting woman, and doing great decisions, and so she gave me very good reading material, but she wasn't particularly. She might have given me Paul Tillich's book, The Courage to Be,
Oh, interesting.
which I probably didn't
Wow.
read. but, but she, but so what I mean by the opposite, I mean that I suddenly was getting these, like, what is the nature of reality? Wait a minute, who am I? And
Sure.
what is this?
Sure.
God, there seems to be this whole other dimension of things I can sense somehow, with a spiritual aspect to it. So that opened me up to being interested in those areas versus pulling those areas together.
Sure, sure. Okay, yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah, this next question might you might already be answering it in part at least, but I'm curious about kind of some of your own first exposures to mind altering agents, and what, if any, kind of psychological or spiritual significance did you find as you were experiencing those things?
Yeah, I don't know if you read in my book about my first experience drinking alcohol, or where it
Yes.
made a big difference. But
Yeah.
I was at my sister's wedding reception, and my cousin said, "You should try the champagne." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "It'll make you feel different." And an hour or two later, I was running around to the tables, finishing off people's glasses of champagne. And in retrospect, then I was sick all night, of course. I thought that, this really encapsulated my entire drinking career. You know,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
drank to make myself feel different. When I started, it was hard to stop, and then I got sick. So,
yeah, yeah.
but there were early. I mean, it was quite a revelation to me that you could, change how you feel just by,
Mm-hmm.
taking a drink of this, and for a while anyway, change it for the better. And I also remember, I was. I think it must have been around the holidays, but I was lying. I bought George Harrison's, first album, All Things Must Pass, and I was listening to My Sweet Lord. And I was pretty drunk, and I really felt like I was having a religious, experience there. Connecting emotionally to, wanting to find God. And we had a foreign exchange student with us. I was telling him about it. I think he thought I was, well, drunk, which I was, and not, which I don't think I was. I mean, we read a lot about poets and other people who, use alcohol to tap
Sure.
into some of these religious
Yeah.
sentiments. So that's my conventional one. Then I started smoking pot, and that, as most people would know, heightens one's sensory awareness
Right.
in a very nice way. So music, really became a different kind of experience with pot, and also there's a sense of, like, there's something more going on. I don't quite know how to put it, but
Yeah. Yeah.
things have another dimension, another aspect to them that I've been neglecting, and so that sort of opened up a sense of, broader sense that there's a spiritual or religious dimension to things. And my first LSD experience, I had mescaline, which was a pleasant experience, but it wasn't as dramatic as when I had my first LSD experience, which
Sure.
I jotted down here, blew my mind, like we used to say. And, it was just such an intense, everything felt so intensely.
Mm.
And there's a whole plasticity of experience, things. It was winter up in Wisconsin, and some friends and I went out on the lake. It was frozen over, and there was an ice boat out there, and it felt to me like I was, up in the Arctic in a, expedition, caught in the ice, and I mean, in an incredibly vivid way. So that was a further thing that just it shocked me how wide the range of possible experience is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to talk about one of the critiques that I think is must be a common critique of psychedelics, because I've heard it quite a bit, which is that they're kind of a shortcut, right? That to some kind of spiritual vision, or that they, if not a shortcut, there's some kind of like mountaintop experience, or they offer some kind of mountaintop experience that is then kind of hard to relate back to ordinary life, or to make meaning of in kind of the day-to-day mundane details of our lives. So I'm curious to hear what sort of you make of these criticisms, or what are your thoughts when you hear people make these criticisms?
Well, I don't know if there's anything wrong with a shortcut. It can be a good thing, and it can alert you that this is something that's there.
Sure.
Um, I believe Houston. Do you know Houston Smith? Does that ring a bell?
No, I don't.
He was back when I was younger. He was considered he had a book called I think the Religions of Man.
Hmm.
Which was used probably in endless religion, introduction to religion courses. But he was involved with some of the early psychedelic people. I think Leary and he said, I believe he said that he'd been meditating for 20 years, but when he took psychedelics, it was a deeper spiritual experience than he'd had in 20 years of meditation.
Hmm.
Um,
Wow.
Now, I think that there are difficulties related to what you're asking. People can have a very powerful experience, and then not integrating it back into the everyday world. It can be difficult, is difficult,
Hmm.
which is when probably that meditating for 20 years after that can be very helpful. Um,
Hmm.
as I said, well, I don't know if I said I did a 3-year training group with Stan Grof and his wife on holotropic breathwork. Which, do you know holotropic breathwork at all?
Yeah, yeah, I do.
There was a technique they using breath work, music, and supportive environment to
Hmm.
induce non-ordinary states. And and you can psychedelics and all kinds of non-ordinary states create experiences that can be challenging in both positive and negative ways. That top, you can, besides being at that top of the mountain, you can also be underneath it, buried alive.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot that can come out to be worked through, and that's why Grof and methods based on his research stress the importance of various kinds of reentry methods. There's body, in the breathwork itself, there's body work and mandala drawing to try to get some kind of integrative image, and voluntary group sharing, but also follow up therapeutic sessions or group sessions can be really, really helpful for
Hmm.
integrating these kinds of things, and not just being okay, you blew your mind and now it's time to go back to work. you know,
Sure.
that's a rough thing. Or
Yeah,
to your partner, and
sure.
they may not be interested in hearing about how you encountered the devil and God, and now
Yeah.
you're moving to India. So,
Yeah.
I mean, there are these are very, very powerful substances, and it's a little. Stan Grof was very respectful of them. He was shocked. He was very surprised to find out people were taking them and going to Disney World. Um, he sort of thought, well, this is a chance to have to open up to your deeper spiritual self. And rather than the teacups, the
Sure.
Mad Hatter's teacup ride. All of which, by the way, I don't think I mentioned in my book, I did on PCP, and that's not a good idea either.
Gosh. Yeah,
Um,
I'm also interested because you've already mentioned several non-psychedelic kind of mind-altering agents, and you talk about several in your book as well. I'm curious if you've noticed any sort of significant differences just from your own kind of experience between psychedelics on the one hand and maybe other mind-altering agents or methods, especially ones that people might be a little more open to than they would be to psychedelics, like the breathwork, the holotropic breathwork you were talking about, or something like that. And then maybe also, have you yourself kind of developed a preference over time for one or the other of these different kind of agents or methods?
Yeah, well, I think most people have an experience with drinking alcohol. And it's,
Right.
that's an easy entry into a non-ordinary state and can be disastrous in the short and long term. But I really did enjoy just that relax. About 20 years into sobriety, we were having a New Year's Eve party with my wife, and we had about 40 friends over, and she'd made up two punches, one non-alcoholic and one with alcohol that looked identical. And I picked up someone else's glasses and took a sip of it and thought, I couldn't even tell, but it seemed like, they might have alcohol in it. So I put it away. And about 20 minutes later, I got this,
Yeah.
I can relax, feel like, and my body is really sensitive, because I hadn't drank in 20 years. My body is very sensitive to it. But it reminded me of, I just love that. I can relax, feeling. So if I could, I'd probably still be doing that. But that stopped being how it was for me.
Sure.
I liked pot a lot, and that's a nice intro. Probably, although I hear now, I was just talking to a friend of mine who I was in, who got sober when she was young and had been recently smoking pot for a few years, going back to that. And at first, apparently, it was fine, and then it became a problem. But she said that the marijuana now is so unbelievably strong and so modified that probably I can't even say anything relevant to it.
Sure.
I mean, back when I was doing it, we'd be smoking joints, for hours.
Right.
And so it's really a social thing,
Yeah.
And now it sounds like you take a couple hits and you're tripping your brains out. Mescaline I liked because it was milder in my experience. Not as overwhelming, a little as some other psychedelics. I really liked MDA, which is kind of like ecstasy or MDMA, but it's a little less psychedelic. And I remember playing foosball on that, and I'm sure it's illegal to take MDA and be in a foosball tournament because you're really your high, your energy's high, and your perception's enhanced, and so that thing that I found a lot, and that probably ecstasy. Although I didn't take ecstasy, that would probably be a nice introduction drug also for people who wanted a psychedelic experience that isn't as overwhelming as with some drugs like DMT, which I don't remember if I took, but that completely. That's from what I hear. That's really, really strong, and but I think in a certain way, I think LSD was my favorite just because it was the most challenging and also the most profound, and really felt like new realities were being revealed that were more than simply altered states of consciousness, and really just opened me up in often a very scary way. For me, there was this trajectory of getting more and more anxious. My body felt weird, and finally I'd hit this point, and then it would something would release, and then I would, the rest of the trip was a lot easier. Unfortunately, I didn't know about the proper way to use psychedelics back in those days, and I would have gotten, I think, a lot more out of it if I had somebody supporting me to move through some of those challenging times, and being able to let go into them rather than fighting them.
Yeah. So, have you tried the holotropic breathwork as well?
Well, yeah, I was in the 3-year training group. So
So you've tried it.
we met every. I mean, I did it a few. I've done it other places, but in that group, we met for 11 or 12 days, twice a year for 3 years, and we'd have either 2 or 3 breathwork sessions for. You do it in pairs. So you'd have 2 or 3, each time in each of those groups. So I did I mean, I didn't do it hundreds of times, but I've done it dozens of times.
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
And it's,
How would you compare that to like your experience with LSD, for instance?
I would say it can be as powerful, but most cases it's not. People have very, which can be an advantage. It's a little more, it's
Hmm.
more manageable. And also, with LSD, if you after an hour you decide you're not enjoying it very much, that's too bad, buddy,
Yeah.
because you have another 8 hours to go.
Yeah.
With holotropic breath work, you can stop breathing, and get up and move around and get out of the space. So that's a real advantage for people who are at all nervous about it, or feeling, well, for everybody who might get into a situation that they want to take more easily.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but I've had some powerful experiences on it, and some people I was with had some really powerful experiences. Well, this German man who was in our group said he was at Esalen and did his first holotropic breathwork session with the Grofs, and which he said was more powerful than any psychedelic experience he'd had. And he said he's walking around, and he was, his energy and aura had become so powerful that people were like coming up to him and kneeling down in front
Oh my
of him
gosh.
because he was so, he was God, as it
Yeah.
were.
Sure. Sure.
So it has that potential. So usually not as powerful, but maybe in certain ways better for a long term growth.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Okay, I want to kind of transition into the more like theoretical underpinnings of your book. So the different sort of theoretical frameworks that you're working with in the book. So two kind of big influences that you come back to over and over in your book are, on the one hand, the which you've already mentioned. You already mentioned both of these, but the transpersonal psychology of Stanislav Grof, and then second, the process philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead. So maybe we could start with Grof, and I'm wondering if you could share kind of what his influence, or what influence his work, I should say, has kind of had on you at both a personal and kind of an intellectual level.
Sure. I think the first thing I encountered when I was at New College, and in the midst of my wondering what this is all about, his Realms of the Human Unconscious, his first book, which summarized his findings and thinkings from his psychedelic research, and especially in Czechoslovakia, where he had a wing of a psychiatric institute that was devoted to psychedelic therapy. So he had a lot of experience with that, and so he
Mm-hmm.
wrote about that, and about the implications of that for how he saw the world. So that helped me. It was helpful. It was especially helpful because I discovered that my experiences, while extraordinary, were not unusual. And he outlines a cartography, he calls it, of extraordinary experience, and which goes from encounters with deities, out of body experiences, all the way into some very powerful experiences of of something like God. He calls it the super
Mm-hmm.
cosmic void. So
Mm-hmm.
various aspects of the depths dimension. So anyway, he has this cartography, which is very, if one can place one's experience in some context, that was very helpful for me. And he also
Mm-hmm.
has a very interesting expanded theory of the unconscious, which sort of combines Freud, Rank, uh, Reich, and Jung, and elements of Eastern thought. And he also has very interesting ideas on how non-ordinary states arise, and the sources of psychopathology is really quite interesting, and healing, and his thoughts on what the holotropic states can tell us about the nature of reality and ourselves. I should say that holotropic is a word that he coined. It means moving towards the whole.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't, sometimes he used altered, and he didn't want to use altered states because that
Mm-hmm.
implies that our everyday of conscious is the standard by which to judge everything else.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
anything else is kind of could be pathological. And he didn't really want to use non-ordinary states because, getting drunk is a non-ordinary state.
Mm-hmm.
Being being in a coma is a non-ordinary state, but he wanted to focus on the ones that were particularly attuned to what you might call spiritual growth and wholeness. So one of the things he writes about is memory that he thinks that psychedelic experiences give evidence of memory without a material substrate, which is a big challenge to the materialist theory of how the brain works and experience works, and I think actually has a nice parallel in Whitehead. But I'll just mention that the Grofs they became friends almost immediately after I met them at Esalen. And being in that group I was mentioning, meeting every 6 months, it was a really nice community. There were about 30 of us, and it was very intimate sharing. There are people going into really deep experiences and then coming out and talking about them over almost a 2-week period. And it also gave me a non-drug method for accessing non-ordinary states, which had been so important to me. So that was great. And Stan was on my dissertation committee, and has been a great friend. And one of the fun things was, I started this about 1.5 years into sobriety, and I was worried, I'm going to be around, I don't know, going to be in altered states, and I'll probably be around people who are getting high,
Right.
and I'll be alone up there, and it turned out Christina Grof had started sobriety about the same time I did. So I was having little AA meetings with Christina, which is one of those synchronicities that's, quite wonderful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing all of that. Okay. How about Whitehead and kind of process philosophy? What have you found particularly compelling about that framework?
That's a big question, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
In one, I wished I could have found a way in my book to make everybody go, "Oh, that's why Whitehead's so wonderful. He made it so clear and easy." But not many people have tried to make Whitehead clear and easy. But John
it was the easiest thing to understand that I've ever read on Whitehead. So I don't know if that, I think that's a compliment to it.
That's a huge compliment.
Yeah.
It means you haven't read anything else on Whitehead.
That's
But don't tell me. I'm going to take that to my heart. Take that to heart.
Okay. That's good.
I told you I did this directed reading with Will Beardsley, and really, I'd gone through a lot of frameworks. Phenomenology was very big for a while because of its, it tells you something about experience. It is about experience. Mm-hmm. And I'd been into Buddhism and Eastern thought, and I was into archetypal psychology, with James Hillman, and which is kind of a Jungian phenomenological thing. And but then when I started reading Whitehead, I realized I really did want something that was an overarching or underarching framework where I could move between different disciplines and ideas, and have that make sense, to be able to talk about mystical experience and neurology and consciousness and quantum theory. People try to combine these things in what I consider often very awkward attempts. And I've got some physicist friends who get outraged when when parapsychologists start trying to explain that in terms of quantum phenomena. I shouldn't say outraged. Sure. They're disdainful because they don't think they know what they're talking about. Yeah. And I don't think they do. I think they're reaching to make connections, but I think Whitehead allows you to make those connections in a way that's helpful and accurate. So what does Whitehead? What does he say? Well, he draws the basic nature of reality for him are these momentary drops of experience, like William James talked about. Now, William James wanted to make it some kind of neutral monism, which never quite made sense to me. I think he was still grappling. But Whitehead drew on his ideas, And what you have is this mostly unconscious flow of feeling, really, of moments of feeling or pulses of energy or pulses of reality, as it were, which applies to quantum phenomena, which applies to cells, to molecules, and to human moments of experience, and potentially to gods. Although Whitehead, there's a little thing about Whitehead and what God's like. But from the revised version that we think of from Charles Hartshorne, God also are these momentary synthetic feelings of past events and creating a continued serial flow, as it were, of these pulses. So this is very close to Buddhism, really. Buddhist. When you do Buddhist analysis, it's these flow of moments of experience that are made up of the past causal influences. Whitehead's a little bit different. I think actually a little bit better. John Cobb has a wonderful book called Beyond Dialogue, where he discusses these things in some detail. But by having the same sort of fundamental description, although it vastly different levels of complexity, from going up from quantum through molecules and cells and human beings and whatever else lies beyond, you can deal with issues like the mind body, or the hard problem of consciousness. You can think through these issues in a way, I think, that makes sense to me. As I said, it's tough to briefly outline his thoughts.
Yeah. It sounds like it's tough to do even within 300 pages of a book. So I commend you for doing so.
Let me say one more. Whitehead starts from experience, and the fundamental things in his metaphysics are experiential in nature, as it were. David Griffin calls it pan-experientialism. But that doesn't mean that everything is consciousness. That means almost nothing is consciousness. But he goes, consciousness is the occasional crown of experience. So it's very like a depth psychology in a way, in that there's this unconscious flow of feeling between events that for certain entities has some little froth that is conscious, and since the neurons making the brain are the same kind of thing, you could have this flow of feeling between the neurons and the momentary human experiences. And so, it's really great for exploring neuroscience. I think there has to be a book to be written about this, which probably would not be me, but it should be written. And he also, this fundamental notion of the past flowing directly into new moments of experience provides a mode of access, for parapsychology, as well as for perception and memory, but for parapsychology and mystical experience. So it's very valuable for me for coordinating how transpersonal psychology, transpersonal experiences might occur.
Yeah. Do you see any sort of intersections between like Grof's work and Whitehead's work? Because I know you say in the book that the two can kind of complement and reinforce one another, especially in regards to kind of non-ordinary states of mind. So I'm curious what you would say about sort of in what ways do they do this? In what ways would you say that they complement and reinforce one another?
Well, Grof's depth psychology in general fits very well with Whitehead's idea of this flow of feeling into the unconscious phases. But I'd say it's true of depth psychology in general. But Grof's, some of Grof's findings that he draws out of his many examples of holotropic experiences. I just mentioned that one, that you don't need a material substrate for memory. And with a Whiteheadian point of view, memory is the flow of feeling from past events. As in my book, I find those reinforcing for each other. Whitehead, provides a mode for that to happen, and Grof finds evidence of it happening. Although I think it has to be a little more complicated than that. I think that the neural network, so to speak, has to play a part in some of the memory, maybe in like rote memory, when I can't remember some singer's name and I go through the alphabet to try to find them. It seems like there must be cues in the brain. I also mentioned towards another, I think, very kind of interesting areas. Grof has describes these ultimate, the metacosmic void, sort of an encounter with the divine archetype, and a few others that fits very well, I think, with Whitehead's theory of God that he articulates at the end of Process and Reality. Now he talks about a primordial and a consequent nature, which really are both embodied within the same entity, as it were, but with different focuses. And I think really the kinds of experiences or description of the general categories of these things that Grof describes fits surprisingly well with Whitehead's description of the qualities of God's nature. And I think Whitehead really helps clarify some of the ambiguities in Grof's descriptions. And while Grof provides evidence, that people in mystical experiences have something that sounds a lot like what Whitehead is describing. I also mentioned towards the end that something like transpersonal, a process transpersonal cosmology. So where you're trying to put together Whitehead's thought with Grof's cartography and his general take on spirituality. And I think, have you read William James's A Pluralistic Universe? That's the last thing he wrote, and he has a chapter on Gustav Fechner and a chapter on Henri Bergson, and he's drawing on them. I think Fechner just was was this scientist, psychologist, one of the founders of psychology, and then he had this kind of breakdown, or something happened where he then had this whole view of everything was alive, everything was inspirited, plants and stars and planets, and so he and Bergson has a thing, elan vital, everything has some kind of life energy. And so James is arguing that we need to thicken things up, that our materialistic worldview just is too flat and is ruling out, just rules out of court a lot of important dimensions that people have talked about. And what's his favorite line? He has a line that's something like, "In order to have enough, you have to have too much." So, but I think that this kind of and Henri Bergson is a process philosopher, and Gustav Fechner is a transpersonal psychologist in his later career. I think both could be categorized as that easily. And so, in my book, looking at Whitehead as the process philosopher and Grof as the transpersonal psychologist, I think you really just have an updating and upgrading, in a way, of what William James was trying to advocate for in his book. And they support each other very, very well, I think, and in creating this kind of richer, spiritually informed universe.
Yeah. With our last couple of questions, I want to kind of dig down into Whitehead's thought a little bit. Maybe this will be, I don't know, maybe this will be easier, or maybe this will be harder than answering sort of a very general question about Whitehead. So I want to talk about his idea of prehension, or feeling. So that's a term that comes up a lot in your book. And so for those who are not familiar with Whitehead or familiar with that terminology, what does Whitehead mean when he uses the word prehension?
He's talking about one of maybe his most fundamental metaphysical innovation. And it's a direct, it's a feeling, it's feeling the feelings of others, So when he uses the term prehension, it's a takeoff of prehensile, which prehensile tale is one that can grasp So you've got these newly arising moments of experience are grasping past feeling. The past feeling is both flowing into the new occasion, the new moment, the new pulse of experience, and is being grasped by it. And so that he uses, he talks about the fallacy of the perfect dictionary, which I think is great. The idea that we have a word for everything. So, but if you do come up with a new idea, if you use a word you already have, then people don't think you're referring to that. But if you come up with a completely new word, then people think you're being obscure. So he tries to find do a Goldilocks between those. So he uses it goes prehensile is a word, and prehension, so he uses prehension. So it's got some familiarity, but distinguishes from if he just says feeling, then people already think they know what he means. And feeling is basically the same as prehension, although there's all kinds of complexities in the way he goes about systematically developing these ideas. But the notion that that feeling is, although it does imply emotional tone, but more broadly it refers to the subtle flow of energy or sensation or information that occurs between events in the universe. The most direct experiences that we have of this primitive flow of feeling from one event to another, one is very short-term memory. If you're talking with somebody and have a sentence going on, or if you're listening to music, there's like an ongoing, you don't just hear one word and then you hear another word and then you hear, you have a flow of a sentence. Or music, you're able to feel a whole flow of musical notes. Otherwise it'd be rather, it'd be this very jerky thing. And so that flow of just past events is one of our experiences of what he means by prehension, of this ongoing flow of feeling. And the other examples are bodily sensations, primitive ones like hunger or pain. If you stub your toe, your toe hurts, but you're feeling your toe hurting, right? So there's this flow of feeling from the toe directly into experience. So those are our human levels, but he wants this sense of that the new occasion is this pulsing alive, feeling thing that's going on, which is sort of how I think I tend to be able to repress feeling really well. So that's one reason I love drugs. I can feel again. But artists, can be overwhelmed by their feeling, and a feeling that modern society has sort of tamped down, feeling to a great degree. So I feel, in a way, I think, is a recovery. Whitehead was very fond of the Romantic poets, who were very good at this sensing the feeling, in the world. But as I said, prehension is this grasping, and within the moment of itself is this synthesizing and unifying and bringing together into this new moment. Sometimes do you get the feeling that you suddenly have an insight? You're thinking about a problem, and suddenly this insight occurs. That's a really good example of how a moment, an event in Whitehead's thinking, Whitehead's theory works. It's this sudden flow, this rush of putting things together, and then there's this new, oh yeah, that's how that works. That's what Whitehead thinks is the general paradigm for how our experience is.
Sure. So, in terms of kind of non-ordinary states of mind, how do you see Whitehead's idea of prehension speaking to that sort of experience? Like, what sorts of feelings or prehensions occur for a person who's experiencing some kind of non-ordinary state?
I think when you're in these non-ordinary states, well, for one thing, you become more aware of the sensations in your body. Often there's like
Hmm.
this moving around, and I feel like
Yeah.
something's trying to rise up and get out, as it were. So there's this increased awareness of the bodily blocks, and especially in feelings. And basically, there's this. I'd say there's an increased flow of feeling. Stan Grof says psychedelics are a non-specific. It's either unspecific or non. I think it's non-specific amplifier of unconscious processes.
Hmm.
So you get your feelings that are normally below the surface rise up,
Hmm.
and so bodily sensations, music, becomes just far more acute and sharpened in awareness. The And more generally, and sometimes things that are way below the surface, enter in. So mystical experiences or paranormal experiences. You can think, am I actually hearing that person's thoughts?
Hmm.
That's
Hmm.
that's and maybe you're not, but
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
maybe there does seem to be something there. Have you heard this new uh, show or series that's on? What is it called? It's about autistic children being telepathic.
No, no, I haven't heard of that one.
I just talked with a friend who's been listening to it and heard it from some other. I think they just had a few episodes, but apparently that there's this whole phenomena which hasn't been much said about.
Hmm.
Probably but that anyway, if you just put that into your browser,
Yeah.
yeah, telepathic autistic kids, it's something I think I need to listen to. And you'd sort of, you might expect people who aren't paying as much attention to, or have a different relationship with the sensory world, that they might have heightened attention to other more subtle dimensions.
Sure. Sure. Is this show you're talking about? Is it a? I'm seeing stuff come up for a podcast. Is it a podcast? The
What does it say for?
telepathy, the telepathy
That's it.
tapes. Does that sound
That's
right?
it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're
Okay.
right. It is a podcast. I'm so out of the whole podcast series
No,
world that.
no, no. It's all good. It might be a video podcast. I don't know. Okay. Well, as we kind of come to a close here, do you have anything you want to plug here? That's something I like to do for everyone who comes on, is just give you a chance to share about any works you have in progress, and then also if you want to share where listeners can find you or learn more about your work.
Well, a person I deeply respect said that my Processing Reality, Finding Meaning in Death and Psychedelics and Sobriety, the book we're just discussing, is the clearest exposition of Whitehead he's ever heard. So I'm quite excited about that. Yeah, so that's the book we're talking about today, and that's where
Yeah.
I go into the most detail of these ideas. I was a contributing co-editor for an earlier book on extraordinary experience titled Rethinking Consciousness, which has chapters by Stanislav Grof and David Ray Griffin, John Cobb,
Mm.
Larry Dossi, and others. And my website is processingreality.com. And it's got some of my podcasts and papers and other writings there. And I'm working on a science fiction book.
Oh, nice. That sounds fun.
Hopefully, it won't take the 30 years that this book took to come out.
Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully not. Well, John, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time. It was very fun listening to you and hearing your stories and learning from you about psychedelics and process philosophy and transpersonal psychology. Thank you.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Thanks for making it so easy.